Ms. McKnight, could you please state your full name and spell your last name?
Cheryl Knight, K-N-I-G-H-T.
And how are you employed?
I work at American Family. Right now, I currently am in the Claims Customer Care Center as of Monday. Prior to that, I was in the life claims area as a senior claims representative.
And what does that mean?
I process death claims and disability claims prior to my new position.
Okay. And American Family is what kind of company?
It's a life insurance company. We also insure automobiles, homes. So it's a multi-line insurance company.
Are you aware whether Julie Jensen had an insurance policy or multiple insurance policies with American Family Insurance?
Yes.
And how many did she have?
She had 2 policies.
And what was the value of each policy?
Each policy she had was for $50,000.
For a total of $100,000?
Right.
And how are those policies paid out?
We haven't made a decision yet.
Generally?
Generally how they're paid out? It could be paid out in a lump sum to the beneficiary, or they could choose a settlement option.
Are you aware of when Mrs. Jensen took out these insurance policies?
One policy was taken out in 1992, and one policy was taken out in 1995.
And who were the beneficiaries, or who was the beneficiary of these policies?
On both the policies, Mark Jensen is listed as the beneficiary.
And so in the event of Mrs. Jensen's death, the American Family Insurance would make payment of $100,000 to Mr. Jensen?
Provided that he was not implemented in the crime in any way. He would, at this point in time, we have to make sure that he is not the person that committed any type of crime. We didn't have a final death certificate to make the decision.
Okay. So if Mr. Jensen was responsible for his wife's death, you would not pay him the insurance policies on Mrs. Jensen's life insurance, correct?
Correct.
Okay. Who would receive the money then?
It would be the contingent beneficiaries.
And who were the contingent beneficiaries?
To all lawful surviving children born to the marriage of Mark and Julie Jensen.
Okay. What would occur in the event that Mrs. Jensen committed suicide?
They would be payable to the primary beneficiary, which is Mark.
So even if Mrs. Jensen committed suicide, Mr. Jensen would still receive the $100,000?
As long as her death was ruled a suicide on the death certificate, on the final death certificate.
And after, were you made aware of Mrs. Jensen's death at some point?
Yes.
And do you know by whom?
It was reported by the agent.
Okay. And was a claim filed against those 2 insurance policies?
Yes, it was.
And who was the claim filed by?
By Mark.
By Mr. Jensen?
By Mr. Jensen, correct.
And do you recall, or do you have knowledge as to when he filed the claim seeking the money on Mrs. Jensen's insurance policies?
I believe it was in 98 that we received his claim forms.
Okay. Do you recall when in 1998?
No.
Is there anything that would help refresh your recollection?
The policies itself, the life insurance files, that has the documentation in it.
And do you have those here?
Yes.
Does Mr. Zelke have them?
Yeah, Mr. Zelke has those.
Okay. I would ask that those documents be produced. Could you please look these over just to refresh your memory? Sure. Any objection?
Was it refreshing your recollection? Is that what you said?
Yeah.
The claim forms received from Mr. Jensen was dated December 21st of 1998, and we consider that as him making a claim on these life insurance policies.
Is that the date you received the claim?
That was the date we received the claim. The date he signed the claim form is December 18th of 1998.
Thank you. Nothing further.
Ms. Knight, you said something about the insurance agent being involved in bringing it to your attention.
Correct.
Was that Dave Anderson?
Right.
And how is it that he brought this to your attention?
He was the person that gave us the first notice of loss. He contacted the life claims area with the information that Ms. Jensen had passed away.
And is it your understanding that he did that on his own after learning of Mrs. Jensen's death?
I could look at
Calls for
the...
speculation.
The objection is, calls for hearsay.
But is that part of your regularly maintained file?
Right. On our phone note, typically what we would do is put the caller's name, and if the agent has given us information as to who has notified him of the passing of an insured, we would typically put that in the documentation as well.
And do you have that information in your file?
I can check here. This was reported to us on December 8th, 1998 by Dave Anderson, and he had just stated that Julie passed away, and he had a newspaper clipping and we'll send it in. He didn't know a cause, it just said at her residence, so he must have seen it. Based on this phone note, he must have just seen it in the obituary, and that's how he kept reporting it to us, gave us information that Mark's husband is alive at address on our screen, which is our system.
So it was the insurance agent that got the ball rolling, so to speak.
Correct.
And do you know then whether somebody from your office contacted Mr. Jensen or what happened next?
We sent a letter out to Mr. Jensen notifying him, letting him know that we were notified of the passing of his wife and asking him to provide us with a certified death certificate, and then along with some claim forms to be completed and returned to us.
And Julie Jensen had taken out one $50,000 policy for herself in 1992?
Correct.
And she was the one who went and obtained the life insurance policy, correct?
Correct.
And is the date of birth of her sons included in your file?
No, I don't believe the dates of birth is. I'm assuming that the other son was born when she made the beneficiary change to include all surviving children in 95. When she took the policy out originally on this one in 92, she did list one child as David as a contingent, with Mark as the primary.
And then it looks like there's another $50,000 policy taken out after the birth of his second son.
That's correct.
And now, Mark Jensen, and that was in 95 was the last activity in terms of changing any life insurance for her?
Right. And that's on both the policies. That was the last change that was made.
And Mark Jensen also had a life insurance policy with you, correct?
Right.
And his was $250,000?
Correct.
That's all, thank you.
Any question?
No, Your Honor.
You may step down.
For the record, will you please state your name and spell your first and last name?
JoAnne Klug, J-O, capital A-N-N-E, K-L-U-G.
And Mrs. Klug, you're married to Ed Klug?
That is correct.
And how long have you been married to Ed Klug?
24 years,
Do you have any children together?
3,
How old are they?
25, 20, and 21.
Now, do you remember a time in early November of 1998, when your husband, Ed Klug, had gone to a convention of some sort for Stiefel Nicholas.
Yes.
Can you please tell the jury what you can remember about the Stiefel Nicholas convention and whether or not you had any conversations with your husband during the course of that convention?
I did have conversations with him.
Well, tell us about the first conversation that you had with him that you can remember as you're sitting here today.
The first conversation I had with him was in the early morning hours of November 7th. I didn't sleep well that night, and he had not placed any phone calls that day to me, which is common after a break, before his dinner, or later in the evening.
Well, which is common, that he doesn't make the phone calls or that he would make the phone call?
Well, yeah, there would be some contact, and there was none prior, so I called early.
About what time of day was it that you called him?
Well, that would have been anywhere from 2:30 to 3:30.
So around
Early morning.
Sometime around 2:30 in the morning you called him?
Yes.
And did he have a cell phone with him, or did you call him in his hotel room, or don't you remember?
I called to the hotel room.
And did he answer the phone?
Yes, he did.
And tell us what you can remember about that conversation.
When he had picked up the phone, he had asked me if I had remembered Mark Jensen. And I said I did. And he said that he was having a conversation with him about wives, and that Mark was telling him that there were websites to go to on how to kill your wife.
Now, how many conversations did you have with your husband that evening, that as you can recall?
I remember 2 conversations.
And so it was during this first conversation you made reference to that?
In his first conversation, he made reference that Mark had wanted to kill his wife and that you could go to websites, and there were ways to do it.
Did he describe any of those ways to do it?
Well, the word Benadryl came to mention.
And how long did this first conversation occur? Or how long did it last, I should say?
I'm guessing 5 minutes.
Now, there's a phone bill that indicates there was a phone conversation from 2:34 a.m. to 2:36 a.m. So that would have been about a 2-minute conversation. Is that the conversation you're referring to?
I'm sorry, but I cannot recollect that conversation.
Well, let me show you.
From 2:30 to 2:30.
Okay, let me show you the phone bill here. In fact, you can look at the screen behind you. And I don't have a pointer, so I'm just going to come up here and use my finger. This reflects a phone call on November 7th at 2:34 a.m., correct?
Yes,
And then another one at 3:38 a.m., correct?
yes,
And then a series of calls, 4:01, 4:02, and 4:06 a.m., is that correct?
that is correct.
Now, as you're sitting here today, which of these, do you remember the phone call at 2:34 a.m. or not?
Let's see. That could have been the one, but I'm not definite.
So there's another phone call at 3:38 a.m. Could that have been the one?
That could have been the one.
Or what about 4:01 or 4:02 or 4:06?
Well, I do remember the 402 and 406. Because
Okay.
I had made a second phone call to the hotel that evening.
Now, I'm asking you to recount conversations that occurred more than 9 years ago, right?
That is correct.
So would it be fair to say that as you're sitting here today, it's kind of hard to remember each and every phone conversation that you had 9 years ago with your husband?
Well, I do remember the 2, but it would be hard to remember if there were more than that. But I do
tell me-
remember 2.
Then let's talk about the 2 conversations that you do remember. The first conversation that you do remember, tell us about that conversation first.
The first conversation?
Yes. The first conversation that you remember.
The first conversation that I remember was when my husband had asked me if I remembered Mark Jensen. And I said, yes, I do remember. And then that's when he told me that he was in the lobby with him and their conversations were on wives. And that Mark was talking about the websites and things that you can use to kill your spouse. And that's when Benadryl was used in that conversation.
Do you remember the context or how Benadryl was used in that conversation?
I do not remember the context on how it was used at that time.
Is there anything else that you can tell this jury that as you're sitting here today, right now, you can remember about that first telephone conversation between you and your husband?
Well, that my husband was agitated about it, and he was interested in about it. And I remembered him telling me that he was going to go back downstairs. And I had told him that that was not such a good idea.
So you didn't think it was a good idea?
No.
And can you, as you're sitting here now today, can you remember why at that time you didn't think it was such a good idea?
Because the nature of the conversation.
You didn't like the nature of the conversation?
That is correct. I didn't like that conversation.
And did you express your opposition or your concerns about that conversation?
Yes, I remember telling him that he was stupid to go and do that, to go downstairs.
Is those the words you used? He's stupid to go down there and do
Well,
that?
in some context of that sort, that he was.
Can you tell us what you can remember saying to your husband? If you don't remember, you can say you don't remember, but
Well, no, I don't remember the exact verbatim what I had told him.
but you conveyed your displeasure at him.
That is
going back.
correct.
And did he go back down there again anyway?
Yes, he did.
Did he tell you he was going to go down there?
He told me he was going to go back down.
And what do you remember then about the second conversation that occurred between you and your husband?
Well, on the second conversation, I called back hoping that he had gone back to his room.
And he had gone back to
And he was there because he picked up the phone call.
And what occurred during the second phone conversation?
In the second one, I had asked him, what would two educated men be downstairs talking like that in the morning? And I had asked, what were you drinking?
You'd asked that of what your husband, what he had been drinking?
What he had been drinking.
Now, by this time you'd been married to your husband how many years?
Well, that was, 10 years ago, so that would have been, let's see, 17?
You've been married about 17 years?
Yeah, well, 9 years ago, 17, 18 years.
Okay. So in the 17 and 18 years that you've been married to your husband, had you ever spoken to him when he was intoxicated?
When he was intoxicated?
Yes. Had you ever spoken to your husband at any time where you are of the impression that he was intoxicated or under the influence of an
Yes,
alcoholic
I
beverage?
think I would notice the difference.
And on this date, on November 7th, 1998, when you were speaking to him during these two phone conversations, as you're sitting here now today, do you remember whether you had the impression of whether or not he appeared to be intoxicated to you?
He appeared to be not intoxicated.
So do you remember what he said to you when you questioned why two intelligent, educated men would be sitting down in a hotel lobby talking about murdering their wives?
Well, he said they were, wife bashing, he said, and we were talking about secretaries.
And did that allay your concerns, or did you continue to object to the nature of this conversation?
I didn't object to the nature of the conversation. I just thought it was kind of disgusting that two men were doing that early in the early morning hours like that.
When was the next time that you spoke to your husband about the conversations that had occurred between your husband and Mark Jensen?
Well, my husband called me from the airport to let me know what his flight would be and his arrival. And
when did that conversation occur, if you can remember?
well, that would have been on a Saturday then.
So later that same day?
Well, yeah, later that same day, much later, I believe it was.
And tell us, as you're sitting here today, what you can remember about that next conversation that occurred between you and your husband, insofar as it pertained to the conversation that your husband had had with Mark Jensen.
Well, I don't remember verbatim, but he had said something with like, can you believe that? I had this conversation, and then I still didn't know the implications of Benadryl at that time. And that's when my husband said that, well, he'll use antifreeze. So with that conclusion being, I know antifreeze is not a very good substance. So with Benadryl and antifreeze, I could see how that could be lethal.
So I'm trying to understand how the words antifreeze came up in this phone conversation between you and your husband when he was at the airport. Were you asking him questions and he was answering them, or was he just talking?
I had a few questions. I asked him, well, how can someone die from Benadryl? And that's when he said antifreeze.
Are those the words he used, antifreeze or ethylene glycol, or do you remember?
No, it was antifreeze. I heard antifreeze.
And you heard the word antifreeze, but you don't remember in what context it was used or how he was using it in connection with the word Benadryl?
No.
Was there any other time after that conversation? Well, I guess we'll withdraw that question. Do you remember anything else about the conversation at the airport between you and your husband?
No, I don't, other than he was going to give me his flight and the time that he would arrive home.
But that's all he talked about with respect to the conversation between him and Mark Jensen?
Yes, from what I can remember.
Now, between that time, between the time that he got back from St. Louis and, say, July of 2007, did your husband ever talk of this conversation that had occurred between him and Mark Jensen with you ever again?
Well, it would have been in December of 1998.
Well, tell us about that conversation.
That was after Julie had passed away.
What did he say to you about the conversation that had occurred between him and Mark Jensen after Julie had passed away?
He said he had contacted Mark to give him his condolences. And then he had said something that Mark had told him that she had been sickly and had been taking too much Benadryl.
Now, at the time that your husband was relating this conversation to you, did you still remember the conversation that had occurred between Mark and your husband in November of 1998?
Yes, I remembered it.
So when your husband related this most recent conversation concerning Julie's death, did the subject of Mark's statements come up?
Not so much as his statements as so much as that it became an actuality, that it became a reality.
What became a reality?
That the use of Benadryl and possibly the antifreeze to kill someone.
Well, so at that point, did you suspect that perhaps Mark had been involved in the murder of his wife?
I had some suspicions that, yes.
Did you or your husband think that perhaps somebody should notify law enforcement?
I remember my husband saying something to me as to, what do you think I should do? Well, that was kind of like putting the ball in my court.
What did you say when he asked you what he should do?
Well, I said something, I was not there, Ed. You heard the conversation. You have to make that decision.
So you didn't give him advice one way or the other?
I did not give him advice as to yes or no on what he should do.
Did you have an opinion as to what he should do?
Objection to relevance unless it was expressed.
Sustained.
When was the next time that you spoke with your husband concerning any conversations that had occurred between your husband and Mark Jensen in early November of 1998?
Can you repeat that again?
When was
What
the
other-
next time after that conversation in December, after you've been made aware of Julie's death, was there any other time after that that you and your husband discussed the conversations that had occurred between your husband and Mark Jensen, where Mark Jensen was talking about killing his wife?
Nothing else in 1998.
When was the next time that you can recall that you and your husband discussed that?
Well, it would have been in 2002.
And what precipitated the conversation between the two of you in 2002?
Well, in 2002 was when my husband said that Mark had been arraigned for Julie's murder.
And at that point, it occasioned another conversation between you and your husband concerning this Mark Jensen's plans to murder his wife?
Repeat that? It was,
So in March of, or sometime in 2002, after Mark Jensen had been arraigned, that's the next time that you and your husband discussed the conversations that occurred in St. Louis in November of
Yes.
1998.
just very briefly.
Tell us about that conversation.
Well, that was where Ed was still fighting about his role in it and what he should do.
So what did he tell you that he thought his role should be?
That I cannot recall anything more after that, in 2002.
I'm sorry, I don't understand what you just said.
I don't recall our conversation thereafter.
Okay.
From 2002, it was very vague.
So you don't have a recollection of the conversation that occurred between you and your husband?
No, just other than he told me about Mark's arraignment. And I know he was fighting it inside on how he was going to, what he was going to do. But then thereafter, nothing.
You don't remember any more about that conversation?
No.
You don't remember whether you gave him any advice or he asked for any advice?
I don't think he asked for advice at that time.
Did you give him any advice?
I thought I just told him that, again, that the ball was in his court, that it was something that he would have to do.
Had you ever met Julie Jensen before?
I had not met Julie, no.
Had you met Mark Jensen before?
I had met Mark.
Well, how much did you know about your husband's business activities with Stiefel Nicholas?
How much did I know about his business?
Yes.
Well, when he moved from Baird, Robert W. Baird, to Stiefel, that would have been in October of 1998. He was moved there as senior vice president.
Now, do you know if there was any money that changed hands between your husband and Stiefel Nicholas in exchange for him coming over to Stiefel Nicholas from Baird?
Objection, hearsay.
Well, she was asked if she knew, and if she knows, you answer.
Do you know of any money that
Not what
changed?
you heard from others, but...
But yes,
No.
that is common practice between firms.
How much money?
Objection to her testifying about common practices rather than what her own knowledge is in this particular.
Do you, what's the source of the knowledge that you have, ma'am?
The sources of my knowledge would be my husband.
All right, it's hearsay.
Well, do you know how much money changed hands between Stiefel Nicholas and your husband when he moved over from Baird to Stiefel Nicholas?
Objection, hearsay.
Did you either see the money or see it show up on your accounts and things?
Well, I believe I had heard it. I didn't see it personally.
Sustained.
Okay. In 1997, your husband at one point had filed for divorce, is that correct?
That is correct.
He moved out of the house?
Yes.
And how long was he out of the house for?
1 month.
And then you moved back into the house?
Yes.
No further questions.
Colby?
This is Klug.
How long did you talk with your husband last night about his testimony yesterday?
Just very briefly.
15 minutes?
Probably less than 5 minutes because he didn't want to talk to me about it.
What did he tell you?
He just let me know how tough it was up here, and so,
And did you talk about your prospective testimony with your husband on your way down here?
no, he didn't ask me for it.
Well, you live in Appleton area, correct?
That is correct.
And you had to drive down yesterday or the day before to get ready to testify, right?
Yes,
And you drove together?
yes.
And did you discuss this case on your drive?
No, we kept our own personal opinions to ourselves.
So you didn't discuss this case at all on that drive?
No,
And how about prior to the time you drove down, going back to, say, December 1, basically the last month or so, have you talked about this case?
in December,
Yes. Or early January?
Early-
Prior to the time you drove down here?
we may have, but I don't remember any high points of the conversation of it.
And how about, you testified on August 30th, 2007, do you recall that?
Yes, I remember.
And between, and after you testified, you talked to your husband about your testimony, correct?
After that day, I did not talk to him about my testimony. He didn't ask me for it.
Well, he was at the courthouse when you testified, right?
Yes,
And you drove back together to Appleton, right?
yes,
And you talked about what had just taken place in the courtroom when you testified, right?
no, he didn't ask me what I had said.
You did? And so you didn't have any conversation about your stint as a witness on August 30th?
No, he did not ask me what I had to say about it.
Okay. And did you ever get a transcript of your testimony?
Yes, I called for a transcript of my testimony.
And you reviewed that?
I read my testimony
How many times?
once when I received it, and I probably reviewed it at least 2 to 3 times since coming here.
And your husband also had his transcript?
My husband had his own transcripts.
And you reviewed each other's transcripts, right?
I saw my husband's transcripts in October of 2007.
So you read his transcript in October. And when did you get your transcript?
Mine was in December.
And your husband reviewed yours at that time?
No.
And after, your husband testified a month before you did, July 30th, 2007, correct?
That is correct.
And you talked to him about his testimony, right?
On July 30th, did I talk to my husband?
Yes.
I asked him how his day went and how he felt about it when he was home in the evening.
You talked to him about the subject of his testimony, right?
About the subject.
Yes, about what he had testified to, right?
I just asked him if he was able to recall from 9 years ago.
And did you ask him what the content of his testimony was?
I knew what the content of the testimony would be, so I didn't have to ask him.
Well, without regard to whether you thought you knew what the content would be, I'm asking if you asked him specifically what he had testified to.
Repeat that again. You asked me?
Sure. Did he tell you what he had testified to on July 30th?
Yes.
And he explained some of the questions that were asked of him, right?
No, he did not explain any questions.
And you read newspaper accounts about his testimony, right?
The only time that I had read about his testimony was that evening. It was right over the internet.
That's right. You read the Kenosha News account of his testimony on the internet,
Yeah,
right? And that summarized what he had to say, right?
Yes,
And it explained some of the problems that he had faced, correct?
that is correct.
And so from that article, you had some idea of what he had testified to, right?
That is correct.
And then you spoke with him 2 or 3 more times after that time and before your testimony on August 30th, correct?
I cannot remember how many times I talked to him afterwards.
But you talked to him several times after he testified and before you testified, correct?
There may have been discussions, but I don't remember how many times.
And he reminded you about what he had said at earlier times since 1998, right?
He didn't have to remind me.
But he did, right?
Reminded me about the,
About his earlier conversation since 1998, he reminded you what he had been saying?
no, I already knew what those were.
Okay, did he, but he told you again what his testimony had been, right?
No, he didn't remind me.
Going back to November 1998, this was about a year after your husband had moved out of the house, right?
A year later. Yes, 1998.
And fair to say that there were still some issues of trust between you and your husband at that time?
I wouldn't say there were issues of trust, no, or of no trust, no.
Well, I'm not asserting that there was no trust between you, but there were some trust issues between you because of the hurt that had happened the year before, right?
Well, that was in 1997, but not in 1998.
Well, you were still a little bit worried when he went somewhere by himself, right?
No, I was not worried about where he goes.
In these conversations on the night of November 7th, you expressed some concern about him being with other women, right?
No, we didn't talk about other women.
You expressed some concern that he might be out carousing with women,
No, that was not an issue.
and you certainly expressed a concern that he may have been drinking, right?
I object to the conjunctive form of the question, Your Honor, when the witness is continually denying the facts he's asserting, and he's continually used the conjunctive, and this and that. She's saying, no, that never happened.
That's a fair objection.
You were concerned about him drinking, right?
There were concerns because of the nature of the conversation.
You were concerned about him drinking too much, correct?
I wasn't concerned that he was drinking too much.
Do you recall the last time you testified on August 30, 2007, at page 160, line 24, you were asked the following question and you gave the following answer. Question, so you were concerned that your husband may have been drinking too much, right? Answer, probably. Correct.
Yes, if
I
that's,
object to the question being taken out of context. When it's placed in context, it's not a prior inconsistent statement. I would request the court look at page 160 and start with the line above that. I'm sorry.
Did you say August the 30th?
Yes, Judge.
And I'd request that the court look at question, at the line
He's already
19.
made his request.
Just, let me find the page first, because I
Sure.
can't do anything until I get there.
In fact, I'll go ahead and read the lines above that. It's fine.
Well, actually, if you want to put it in context, you've got to start on line 11, page 159.
You're saying your concern, here, maybe just do it this way. Your concern about drinking related to the topic of the conversation. Is that right?
yes,
And that's why you were concerned about the drinking.
that is correct.
Is that fair enough? And you also mentioned on your direct examination that your husband told you that they were talking about secretaries, right?
Yes,
And you were aware that your husband at least had some sort of infatuation with a secretary?
yes,
And so that caused you concern that night, right?
no,
That wasn't any concern to you anymore?
no,
1
that
year
wasn't
later?
any concern with me anymore.
All right. And are you saying that neither of you ever hung up in anger on each other on that night?
That is correct.
There were no angry words between you?
No.
Now, in terms of telling your husband to go to the police, what you told him was that he had to make a judgment, is that right?
That is correct.
And you told him that you would stand behind him regardless of what he decided to do, right?
Not in regardless of what he would do, that I would stand behind the truth.
Which you didn't know what the truth was, right?
I knew what my husband had told me.
And you said, you told him that you would stand behind him, true?
That is correct.
And you told him that he had to decide whether he felt what he heard from Mark was true or not, right?
Yes.
And he decided not to do anything, correct?
He didn't do anything then. That is correct.
He didn't do anything in 1998, right?
That is correct.
1999, right?
Right.
2000,
Correct.
2001, right?
Yes.
And it's your testimony that he never even mentioned the subject in 99, 2000, 2001?
I know he made an attempt, but I don't remember the year that he made the attempt. It could have been in 2002.
But first of all,
But
right
then
now I'm
that's-
asking, he never even talked to you about this issue in 1999, 2000, or
No.
2001?
No.
Correct.
Correct.
And in 2002 was the year that Mark Jensen was charged, correct?
That is correct.
And you and your husband had the opportunity to read the news accounts, true?
I didn't read anything on the accounts.
He told you what was in the news accounts, correct?
Yes.
And your husband, your testimonies you didn't talk about with your husband again in 2003, 2004, 2005, 2006?
With our testimonies, no.
Correct, you never talked to him
Never talked to him.
until 2007.
That is correct.
So it would be inaccurate to say that he talked to you continually about these issues?
He didn't talk continually about these issues. It's just if there were any issues during that time period, I don't recall having those conversations with him.
Now, your husband took over as the co-branch manager in March of 1999, right?
That is correct, in 1999.
He was his own boss in the office, correct?
As senior vice president, yes.
There was nobody ahead of him in Appleton, right?
Not in Appleton, not at the Appleton branch.
Now, you had met Mark Jensen in October of 1998,
Yes.
and your husband had told you about Mark Jensen, right?
You asked me, had I
Your
met?
husband had told you about Mark Jensen in October of 1998, right?
He had mentioned that Mark would be helping him with his transition.
And he told you that Mark was having an affair with someone else who was helping with the transition, right?
No, I don't recall that even being discussed with me.
He never told you that
I don't remember anything like that.
at any time?
At any time, I don't recall that.
And after your husband's testimony on July 30th, he told you that you'd be asked to confirm what he had said when you testified, right?
That I would be asked to give in my own words, what I had remembered.
Well, your husband said that you'd be asked to confirm what he said, right?
Yes.
And the reason that you read your husband's testimony in October was to make sure you weren't inconsistent with what he had to say when you testified at trial?
No, it was a matter of curiosity kills the cat, so I read it,
And you read the entire transcript?
pretty much of it.
And you again told your husband you'd stand behind him, right?
I didn't, after reading it, I did not again tell my husband I would stand behind him, not after reading his transcript.
And you understand it would be, well, I'll withdraw that. Excuse me for a moment. That's all I have.
Any question?
Mrs. Klug, when you were subpoenaed back in August to attend the forfeiture hearing, you were subpoenaed by the defense, weren't you?
Objection to relevance.
And I have an objection to characterization as well.
Well, the objection on relevance is sustained.
I'm sorry, the what?
Sustained.
Okay. At the previous hearing, you were subpoenaed to attend that hearing?
Yes.
Were you subpoenaed by the defense or the prosecution? Do you remember?
I object, that was the objection was made.
Well, when you were subpoenaed, before you were subpoenaed, did you speak to me or to Ms. Gabrielle?
No, I did not.
Did anybody from the state, did any law enforcement officer?
Lieutenant Ratsberg,
Okay. You spoke to Lieutenant Ratsberg?
yes.
And did anybody did Lieutenant Ratsberg or any other person ever tell you that you were being called to confirm what your husband said?
Other than we had some unknown gentleman that very evening came to our door and wanted to speak to me. And my daughter-in-law sent him away because we didn't know who this person was.
When you were asked to testify about this case, did anybody tell you what you were supposed to say other than what you could remember about this case?
No one told me what it is I was supposed to say. I just received a subpoena.
And this notion of confirming what your husband said, did your husband ever mention the word or use the words antifreeze or ethylene glycol during the course of his testimony, the transcript that you read, to your recollection?
No, I thought Benadryl. I thought Benadryl. I mean, I remember Benadryl in the phone conversations, but I can't remember after reading it in October of 2007. I can't remember his.
But the first person to use the words antifreeze, to talk about antifreeze in court, that was you, wasn't it?
Objection, that was leading, not in evidence.
The objection is sustained.
Okay. Well, let's go back over the testimony concerning this issue of what you were or were not concerned about, which you were asked about in cross-examination. And do you have the transcript of your testimony in front of you?
No.
Do you have a copy of this? Okay. And Your Honor, I apologize, I don't have an extra copy for you. You'd asked for that. Did you want
I
it?
think, well, actually, I think we're going to take a break at this point anyway.
Okay.
So please don't talk about the case during the break. The usual.
Please all rise. Please be seated.
Go ahead, Mr. Jones.
Mrs. Klug, I'm going to give you a transcript of your testimony. It's been marked as State's Exhibit 28 from a previous hearing. You remember testifying at the previous hearing?
Yes.
And I know that on cross-examination, counsel had directed your attention to page 160, line 24, And he asked you if you had been asked the following question, so you were concerned that your husband may have been drinking too much, right? Answer, probably, on the next page. You remember that?
Yes.
Okay, now let's go and start at page 159, line 11. And I'm going to go through a series of questions and answers and ask you about them. On line 11, do you remember being propounded the following question and giving the following answer? Question, you were upset because you believed your husband had been drinking. Answer, no, not because my husband had been drinking. Do you recall being asked that question and giving that answer at the last hearing?
Yes.
And then the next question, directing your attention, so line 15 and on down. Question, well, is that, and then answer, I was upset because my husband had told me that someone can be killed with Benadryl, because I didn't understand the implications of someone dying from Benadryl. Do you recall that exchange between you and Mr. Albee?
Yes.
And then directing your attention to line 20, question, and did Mr. Klug? Well, it sounds like you asked him what he had been drinking. Wasn't that one of your first questions? Answer, I cannot remember if that was my first question when I called him back. You remember that question and answer?
Yes, I do.
And then the next question, and this is at line 25, counsel. But did you ask him what he was drinking? Answer, that is correct, I did ask. Is that correct?
That is correct.
And then the next question, line 2. Why did you ask that question? Answer, because of the conversation that he told me that he had with Mark. I wanted to find out if they were drinking. Do you remember that question and answer?
Yes, I do.
And then the following question, and counsel, we're at line 6 now. Question, and why? Answer, my husband had switched. He said he drank coffee. Do you remember that question and answer?
Yes.
And then the question. Well, now down to line 19. Well, it was because you were concerned that your husband had been drinking too much. Was that what you were concerned about, right? Answer, well, two men that were drinking and talking that way. Is that your question and answer?
Yes.
And that's when we finally get to the question that counsel had made reference to on cross-examination. Question, so you were concerned that your husband may have been drinking too much, right? Answer, probably. Is that correct?
Yes.
No further questions.
Mr. Albee?
Mrs. Klug, after your husband's testimony on July 30th, 2007, Detective Ratsberg came to see you, correct?
That is correct.
That was the following morning on July 31st, right?
Yes.
And Detective Ratsberg wanted to know everything that you knew about Ed's trip to St. Louis, right?
You want to know what I had heard that evening in St. Louis and what I had remembered at that time.
And he questioned you about those things, correct?
Yes, he had wanted me to do a statement.
And it was Detective Ratsberg, though, first he asked you questions that you answered, right?
That is correct.
And he was taking notes, right?
Yes.
And then he wrote up a statement in his handwriting, correct?
Yeah, as I said it, he wrote it out in his handwriting.
Okay, I'm sorry, maybe I misunderstood you. I apologize. But he wrote down the important things that you had told him, right?
From what I had remembered.
Correct?
Yes, from what I had remembered.
Right, and you knew this was important, right?
Yes, I knew it was going to be important.
And you knew it was sufficiently important that your husband had gone down the previous day from Appleton to Kenosha to testify, right?
Yes.
You knew it was a murder trial, right?
Yes.
And you did the best you could recalling every detail you could to Detective Ratsberg at the time.
From at that time, yes.
And in that statement that you gave Detective Ratsberg, and you feel free to review it if you wish, you said nothing about your husband ever saying anything about antifreeze, true?
Unless I see it in front of me, I don't know.
Sure. Let me show you Defendant's Exhibit.
I'm sorry, can you put it on there?
The Defendant's Exhibit 29.
Thank you.
That is correct. It is not here at this time on this form.
And you signed that statement?
Yes, that is my signature.
And you signed both pages?
Yes, I did.
And between 1998 and 2007, your husband had talked to you on several occasions at least that you had told us about, correct?
Yes, on those several occasions in 1998.
And in 2002, right?
There was the 2002 that I could remember.
And then he talked to you when he got home on July 30th, correct?
Yes, we talked briefly that evening.
And that's when you looked up the story on the internet, true?
Yes,
And so you had all that information when you talked to Detective Ratsberg, right?
I only read just so much of it. I didn't read the whole thing on what was being said, but I read portion of it.
And your husband had told you at the time of the charges that Mark was being charged with poisoning his wife with antifreeze, true?
Yes, that was in 2002, I knew that.
And you were still aware of that in 2007 when your husband testified, right?
Yes,
And it's certainly possible that you're confused about what your husband said in terms of antifreeze.
no, I
in
wasn't confused.
1998.
I was not confused that day on Saturday and when he was in the airport.
I'm saying confused in terms of your memory, Mrs. Klug, and remembering from 9 years ago what your husband said in a conversation when you've heard many other facts since that time.
I was not confused.
Now, you read your husband's testimony on July 30th, right?
I did not read my husband's testimony on July 30th. Well, on the internet, I read what the internet was saying.
You received your husband's transcript from July 30th in October and read it, right?
In October of 1998.
In October of 2007.
Well, yes, sorry, 2007.
Right. And you observed that he didn't refer to any conversation with Mark Jensen about antifreeze in 1998, right?
That I don't remember if he had put that in there or not. Like I said, I read it just that once, and
That's all I have.
You've got Exhibit D29 in front of you there, ma'am?
D29.
That's the statement that you gave to Detective Ratsberg. Is it there in front of you?
No, Mr. Helby has it.
That's why you don't have it in front of you. I'd ask you to read through the entire statement just to yourself, and after you're done reading, let me know.
Judge, actually, I'm going to object unless I hear what the purpose is. Actually, if you could hold off on reading for a moment, Mrs. Klug.
What's the purpose?
Well, there are statements in here that are consistent with her testimony here today and consistent with the testimony she's given in the past. And then there are also, if you look at this entire statement, she doesn't mention any telephone conversation from the airport, which is the only conversation where antifreeze was mentioned.
If it's as a prior consistent statement, it's inadmissible as hearsay.
Well, it's a prior consistent statement being offered to rebut an inference of recent fabrication. And furthermore,
Where's the, to rebut an allegation of recent fabrication?
yes, that In other words, this question is being offered by defense counsel as a prior inconsistent statement.
Let me be sure I understand what the facts are. The testimony was that this statement was taken on the 31st of July of 2007?
Yes.
Yeah, that doesn't really strike me as a statement which would rebut a claim of recent fabrication.
Well, Your Honor, I'm going to ask this witness about this statement, about what the statement pertains to. And counsel is using this statement because she didn't mention.
Speaking objections, Your Honor.
No, I don't think it would be appropriate to, I don't think it's admissible as a, for the purpose you've indicated.
Well, Miss, don't look at the statement then in front of you, Mrs. Klug, but tell me this. When you were talking with Detective Ratsberg, did you or Detective Ratsberg or Lieutenant Ratsberg make any reference at all to the telephone conversation that occurred between you and your husband at the airport?
No.
So when you were talking with Lieutenant Ratsberg on July 31st and he was writing out this statement, what conversations were you talking to him about?
We were talking to him about the websites that you could go to kill your spouse.
And is that what the website was called, Kill Your Spouse?
No, I don't know what the websites are called.
But at the time that you spoke to Lieutenant Ratsberg, do you recall what the term was that you employed when you were talking to Lieutenant Ratsberg?
I object. Again, this is hearsay.
World.
That means you can answer the question. Do you recall the question, ma'am?
Can I have that read back to me, please?
I'll ask the reporter to read it back so I don't get it at all different from how I said it at first.
Question, at the time that you spoke to Lieutenant Ratsberg, do you recall what the term was that you employed when you were talking to Lieutenant Ratsberg?
The term for the websites, do you remember what it was?
I believe I just used websites.
Well, but do you remember the name of any of the websites?
No, there was no specific name for the websites.
Now I'd ask you to look at the letter, the report in front of you, and to see if that refreshes your recollection. Just read it to yourself, and then I'll ask you if reading that report has refreshed your recollection as to any description you gave to Lieutenant Ratsberg concerning the name of any one of these websites.
I see in parentheses here that say, kill your wife.
Do you recall the website, any website named killyourwife.com or anything like that?
No.
But at that time, you gave that information to Lieutenant Ratsberg?
Yes.
As you're sitting here now today, do you remember whether or not your husband, in November of 1998, when he was describing the conversations that had occurred between him and Mark Jensen, ever used the term www.killyourwife.com?
No.
You don't know if he used...
Call or no, that didn't happen.
No, that did not happen.
Okay. I have no further questions. Thank you.
And just so that there's no uncertainty here, in the statement to Detective Ratsberg, you did say nothing about antifreeze or ethylene glycol, true?
Not on this statement.
That's all.
Any question?
No, Your Honor.
You may step down.